Saxby to move the motion. Slane.
I beg to move that this House has considered decarbonising rural transport. And thank you, Mr Davies. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the Backbench Business Committee for granting this debate, which is so important for those of us in rural constituencies like my own of North Devon. Transport is the UK's highest emitting sector and is responsible for 1/4 of our total emissions. If we want to achieve net zero by 2050, we need to reduce emissions from our cars, vans and lorries. But we also need to recognise that rural transport is different to urban, and our reliance on our cars is so much higher. And therefore, we need to include rurality in more decisions about how we move to decarbonise our transportation. Public transport is limited in rural Britain, and given the sparsity of population, expanding it along the lines of our towns and cities in general is not financially viable or even welcome to put enormous buses through tiny country lanes. But finding ways to extend routes, provide smaller vehicles or car shares, and find ways to reintroduce train lines, particularly where we have seen large growth in housing, such as between Bideford and Barnstaple in my North Devon constituency.
Will my honourable friend give way, and thank you, Mr Davies. East Sussex County Council has an excellent bus service improvement plan. One of the objectives of that is to progressively support operators in increasing the number of zero-emission buses used on the network and to upgrade existing diesel buses to Euro 6 standard as part of the drive to achieve net carbon neutrality by 2050. Does my honourable friend agree with me that in order to fulfil this objective, further government funding opportunities will be required to introduce battery electric buses or hydrogen fuel cell buses and for retrofitting to Euro 6 specification, and that decarbonisation of rural transport should not be restricted to local buses, but also trains, hence why the extension of HS1 from Ashford to Rye, Hastings, Bexhill will decarbonise as well as make the journey faster is essential. Would she agree with that?
Slane Saxby.
Thank you, Mr Davies. And I thank my honourable friend, the member for Hastings and Rye. And she's, of course, entirely right that each of us in our rural constituencies have plans that we really need our councils to deliver to facilitate decarbonising our rural transport network. The challenge we have is that, unfortunately, and I hope the Minister is going to reassure us on this point later on, there's not always the funding to support these fantastic rural transport schemes. And I'm going to come on to some of my own suggestions for the bus network in Devon as well. Active travel, on the other hand, is an opportunity for some, but the distances in rural commuting on your bike means it's not always an option for everyone. But in my North Devon constituency, 2.4% of work journeys are taken by bike, which is a surprisingly high percentage for such a rural area. But realistically, active travel is unlikely to replace huge numbers of car journeys unless integrated into a wider transport solution. So I am going to return to the opportunities to tackle public transport and active travel, but I think we need to be realistic that rural Britain is going to continue to be reliant on their cars for the foreseeable future. Of course.
Thank the Honourable Lady for giving way and congratulate her on securing this debate this morning. Limited public transport options in rural communities means that many residents, as she has said, depend on their car for everything, getting to work, to the doctors, to see family and friends. Does the honourable member agree that any strategy to decarbonise rural transport needs to improve these connectivity issues so that social isolation isn't inadvertently increased?
Thank you, Margaret. Slane Saxby.
And I thank the honourable member for her intervention, and I agree entirely there are so many more challenges around rural connectivity. And if we are going to continue to be reliant on our cars, we need to decarbonise those. But the rollout of electric charging points in rural Britain lags behind towns, and when the distances we travel per day are so much greater, investing in an electric vehicle is a far harder decision. Only 1.5% of North Devon residents have gone fully electric, compared to 2.1% nationally. I personally have a hybrid, as the majority of electric vehicles would not even get me to Westminster each week. And I'm not sure I would ever get to Exmoor in my constituency and back home, as there are no charging points at all where I live. The nearest one is 5 miles away, and to plug in at home, I'd need to lay my own cable down 20 foot of path every evening, and I'm not sure my schedule really accommodates this. And whilst I have a Transport Minister here, I would also like to highlight the appalling state of the roads in Devon. I am fully aware we have the longest road network in the United Kingdom by 2,000 miles, and that the Council are working flat out to try and repair the proliferation of potholes we have seen this winter. Not only has the weather contributed, but we need to recognise in rural Britain we have enormous farm vehicles on tiny lanes, and therefore we create even more potholes. Yet our Council is not assigned long-term funding solutions to tackle them. The short-term approach to funding, with inadequate rural weighting, makes the cost of repairing each pothole far higher. And at this time, Devon is moving teams off scheduled roadworks as we cannot take on full-time highways teams because of the uncertainty around long-term funding. I do hope the Minister will be able to take that away and see what more can be done to address the entirely unacceptable state of our roads, as if there was an Ofsted inspection of roads, I suspect we would go into special measures. Yet the current funding mechanism is contributing to this. The damage potholes do to vehicles is also hugely expensive to motorists and the Council, who are no doubt reimbursing a growing number of inconvenienced motorists with damaged tyres, not to mention it's actually deterring people from switching to active travel solutions because of the potential risk of falling over a pothole. I spend a lot of time in this place talking about connectivity, often the communication kind, but our transport connections are vital. And the lack of decarbonised public transport is again impacting on decarbonising our travel. Of course I would agree.
I'm really grateful to her for giving way, and also congratulations for securing a really important debate. When it comes to decarbonising public transport, clearly bus use is massively important in rural communities like hers and mine. I'm sure she's going to agree with me that the £2 cap on bus fares proposed by the government and put into place by the government is a really positive thing. It's positive it's been extended to June, but even more positive it's extended further beyond that. But of course, it's of no use whatsoever if you live in a community where there is no bus service. And I wonder whether, when I'm thinking about places in my own community, like the Cartmel Peninsula, areas in Cumbria like the Eden Valley, where there's a lack of options when it comes to bus services, either far too few or none at all, that it would make sense to give local authorities like the new Westminster and Furness Council the power to start and run their own bus services so we can fill in the gap, so that people can spend their £2 on bus services that actually exist.
Elaine Saxby.
Thank you, Mr Davies. And I do agree with the Honourable Member. Indeed, there is so much more that could be done. And I do feel with so many of these rural transport issues, we actually need localised solutions, and that for our local communities to be able to share their best practice, because actually there's some great local bus solutions up and down the country. But I have a remote district council, which is detached from the county council, which is where highways sits. How do we join up these pieces? And I think more could be done to really come up with these innovative solutions, which already exist in places, but they're not universally available. Indeed, bus travel at all in my constituency is not universally available, let alone decarbonised. And that does make things just as basic as getting to school both expensive and problematic. Our bus company, who I've also recently met, notes that people are tending to make less trips than they did before the pandemic, and are also tending to make shorter and more local journeys as opposed to long-distance trips on a daily basis. This means that public transport providers have had to adapt, but our communities still rightfully expect the same connections to exist as they did before the pandemic, or even new connections developed as society has changed. Broadly, in my constituency, the patronage has recovered to about 80 to 90% of pre-pandemic levels, but with concessionary journeys only recovering to around 70%. This recovery naturally creates a challenge in rural settings where margins were stretched or non-existent before the pandemic. Funding needs to respect rurality and the higher costs of operating these routes. This could be done through paying bus service operator grants on a mile or kilometre basis, as opposed to per litre of fuel to cover these costs. I am assured the industry wishes to engage with the department on these points, so that a longer-term settlement can be reached to support these rural services on a longer-term basis, as opposed to the current cycle of short-term funding we are in, even though this funding is greatly appreciated. Indeed, the current get-around for £2 is fabulous. In my constituency, you can do a fantastic coastal trip from Barnstaple for Linton for just £2. It's a full 26 miles, or get to Exeter on the bus for £2 as well. However, in normal times when this goes, to get from a town like Ilfracombe, which has recently lost its last bank, back into Barnstaple for your nearest branch is normally 2 to 3 times what the current £2 rate is. And we do need to find a way to facilitate these remote rural communities being able to access the services that they need. Other communities, such as Woolacombe, have their employers there providing their own buses so that their teams can get to work, as there is literally no public transport options to enable people to get to work. In the peak of the tourist season, overlay that with parking challenges as well, not to mention the air pollution, where we have huge queues of visitors alongside locals trying to get to our beautiful beaches. And whilst the availability of public transport is my primary concern, decarbonisation of it is an entirely different matter, as the length of rural bus journeys are significantly longer than their urban counterparts. So the capital investment into suitable vehicles is by definition going to be higher in rural Britain. One of the more recent times I've spoken here in Westminster Hall was about looking to reintroduce a rail link from Barnstaple to Bideford. We have also unsuccessfully submitted an inquiry to put a light rail link in from Braunton to Barnstaple. Yet time and again, these projects do not progress, and one cannot help but think that our rurality and sparsity of population is a factor. I very much hope that the Department of Transport will continue the really positive work they've done in active travel, with the latest round of funding, £200 million, including rurality as a factor for the first time. The previous cycling minister indeed visited North Devon to the iconic Tarka Trail. Completing a stretch of the trail would see North and South Devon's coasts fully connected. The project was ranked second out of 6 submitted by Devon County Council. The council team met with the minister to explain their frustration at having the 5 Exeter-based projects succeed, yet their second highest priority project rejected. I am delighted that rurality is now being considered following the minister's visit, and that the Tarka Trail project is now being resubmitted. And I hope that Active Travel England and the department will look very favourably upon it, but also take further steps to enable more active travel solutions to come to fruition in rural Britain. Large counties like Devon, with big urban centres and an enormous rural hinterland, need different approaches for the two. As a community, we would benefit hugely from electric bikes, which can undertake longer, hillier journeys and enable people who may not be able to cycle so far on a traditional bike to make these journeys. But again, electric hire facilities are available at transport hubs in Exeter, but not in Barnstaple. To begin to decarbonise our transport network, we need to look to transport hubs, where active travel can potentially be the first or last mile, and do this for our buses and trains to be better at taking bikes, or hubs to have better bike storage, as well as electric vehicle chargers if connecting to buses or trains, alongside public toilets. I will give way.
I'm taking advantage of her generosity, and I'm very grateful to her for it. I'm in full agreement with what she says about transport hubs, where you can have electric bikes, non-electric bikes, bus and rail interchanges. We've got in our community several railway lines, the Settle to Carlisle line, the Furness line, the Lakes line, the Main line. A great concern for me is that we potentially stand to lose railway station ticket offices at Grange, Appleby and at Windermere. They would be great places to have such hubs, wouldn't they? And therefore, isn't that a good argument for making sure we maintain fully staffed railway stations in rural communities?
Elaine Saxby.
Thank you, Mr Davis. And I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention. And I think it is, again, probably important that we look at rurality in terms of how we deal with all of our infrastructure developments. And around something like train stations, I know that my own ticket office in Barnstaple, I only have the one train line, so I'd say his constituency is particularly well connected, that have their own concerns. But I think we also need to recognise where you are sparsely populated, these people potentially in ticket offices are working less than they would be in a busy town centre. So I think we need to be more innovative in our approach to how we ensure that residents that perhaps do not use the train so often are able to comfortably use their train station and those transport hubs. And so as I was coming on to say, you know, when you come to these connections, for us, things like public toilets are also a vital part of these transport hubs. Barnstable's bus station toilets have actually not reopened since March 2020. And if we are really serious about encouraging public transport usage and decarbonising our transport, we need to recognise that on these longer journeys, with longer waits between buses and trains, we do require these additional facilities to be present, particularly for our older residents. And the lack of the hubs that are safe, warm and with the right facilities at present makes using public transport far harder in locations such as North Devon at this time. Far too many routes in rural Britain are also single carriageway, 60-mile-an-hour roads. And if we're going to tackle this head-on to really facilitate safer cycling and walking on these roads, we do need additional paths potentially to be constructed to facilitate things like safe school journeys on foot or bike, for example. So whilst today's debate is focusing on decarbonisation, I think we could also consider the health benefits of an active travel mode to work or school, which often seem to be somewhat neglected. I recognise, as mentioned earlier, that across the UK there are examples of really great rural transport schemes. And as is the case with so many matters around rurality, as discussed in the debate I led on levelling up rural Britain, it is harder for these examples of best practice to be shared between councils and communities. And I do hope, as we move towards decarbonising our transportation, that more support is given to overstretched councils to be able to share best practice and roll out solutions to rural as well as urban Britain, and find funding solutions that give councils the ability to deliver a decarbonisation plan that reflects rurality, alongside an acceptance that the cost per capita will differ. But in areas reliant on their tourists, our population swells enormously in the summer, which again is rarely reflected in funding settlements or even the calculation of our carbon pollution. Rural Britain deserves to see its transport decarbonised. Our productivity is reduced because of the poor transport links, and I hope the Minister has plans in his department to ensure that rurality is rapidly included into future funding announcements, that there are long-term settlements lying ahead, as it was so warmly welcome to have rurality mentioned in the current round of active travel funding, because we all want to level up and decarbonise transport in rural Britain.
Selene.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's been a pleasure to serve with you this morning, Mr. Davies. I'd like to just thank the Minister for his response and also his department's recognition of rurality, because it is really about the first time that a government department has focused on that within their funding decision. And I do very much hope that with him at the helm over there, that they will be able to do further in some of these other areas that we've touched on this morning, because I know that the constituents that I represent in this place care deeply about their environment and are really passionate actually about being able to decarbonise their transport networks. And for that to happen, the reliance on rural solutions is really important to find these things that actually work and deliver better value for money. And whilst I fully respect that the Minister couldn't possibly comment on things going on in the Treasury ahead of the budget, I do hope he might have a quiet word that actually a longer funding solution would deliver far better value for money in the area of things like rural transportation in the longer term. I'd like to reiterate points made by colleagues. Again, if the Minister would like to pass it on, I didn't focus too much on the grid because I know it's not his portfolio, but I do fully agree with the comments made by honourable members today that the grid is a real concern if we are going to deliver an electric transport solution. The honourable member for North Shropshire talked a lot about changes and hubs, and that the number of different changes you have to make on a bus journey for these longer journeys that you always undertake in rural Britain. And whilst I warmly welcome the Minister's observation on the Barnstaple Hospital services, most of those services you have to change at Barnstaple bus station, whose toilets are still closed. And I think as we look to these rural solutions, we need to find better ways to ensure that these hubs work, because I know he, like I, are passionate about active travel, but we all accept we're not going to be doing all of our journeys in rural Britain on a bicycle, but we could do the first or opening mile or closing mile of those journeys if our hubs worked better. So I'd like to thank honourable members for their time and participation today, and particularly the Minister for his response. Thank you.